The hoe struck something that shouldn't have been breathing 3 feet down in the Virginia tobacco soil on August 17, 1852, and what clawed its way toward the surface would expose a truth so visceral it would redefine the boundaries between oppressor and oppressed. Ashton Bishop's muffled screams pierced through packed earth as fingernails scraped against wood, desperate for air that would never come. This is the story of a man who transformed decades of brutality into a single act of calculated vengeance. A reckoning so methodical that it turned the very fields of enslavement into burial grounds for those who claimed ownership over human souls. What happened in the tobacco rows of Blackwood Plantation wasn't just murder. It was a reversal of power so complete that it challenged every assumption about who truly controlled life and death in the antebellum South and what desperate men become capable of when survival demands the unthinkable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwood Plantation stretched across 847 acres of Virginia's most fertile tobacco country, its boundaries marked by split-rail fences that separated prosperity from wilderness. The August heat created waves that distorted the horizon, making the endless rows of broad-leafed tobacco plants shimmer like green ocean swells. The smell of curing tobacco mixed with sweat and red clay dust, creating an atmosphere so thick it coated the lungs with every breath. The packed dirt paths between the slave quarters and the fields had been worn smooth by decades of bare feet moving in patterns dictated by men who measured human value in pounds of harvested leaf. Ashton Bishop owned this empire of soil and suffering, a third-generation plantation master whose 340 enslaved workers represented the largest concentration of human property in Piedmont County. His great-grandfather had claimed this land in 1781, clearing virgin forest with the labor of men and women purchased from coastal auction blocks. The family wealth had been built leaf by leaf, season by season, with profits reinvested into acquiring more land and more bodies to work it. The plantation house rose 3 stories above the fields, its white columns visible from every corner of the property. A constant reminder of who held power and who existed solely to generate wealth for others. The architecture spoke of European refinement transplanted to American soil, with imported marble floors and crystal chandeliers that caught sunlight in ways that seemed designed to blind anyone who dared look directly at such concentrated privilege. The slave quarters occupied the eastern edge of the property, a collection of wooden structures that housed families in spaces smaller than the plantation's storage sheds. 32 cabins arranged in neat rows, each one identical to the next, creating a geometry of oppression that reflected Ashton Bishop's obsession with order and efficiency. The cabins had been constructed without windows on the sides facing away from the main house, ensuring that enslaved families could never fully escape the visual reminder of their subordinate status. Grant Porter had been born into bondage on Blackwood Plantation on a February morning in 1821, delivered by his mother Cora Lawrence in a cabin that leaked rain through gaps in the roof boards. His first breath had been drawn in air thick with smoke from a fire that provided inadequate warmth against winter cold that plantation masters never experienced in their climate-controlled mansion. His earliest memories involved the weight of a cotton sack and the sting of his mother's tears when she realized her son would inherit her chains rather than any hope of freedom. By 1852, Grant had spent 31 years mastering every aspect of tobacco cultivation under conditions that would have broken weaker men. His hands bore permanent stains from handling green tobacco leaves, the nicotine absorbed through skin, creating patterns that looked like natural pigmentation, but were actually evidence of decades spent in intimate contact with the crop that generated Ashton Bishop's fortune. His back carried scars from whippings, administered for infractions ranging from working too slowly to making eye contact that lasted 1 second too long. The tobacco fields demanded knowledge that took years to acquire and seconds to apply incorrectly. Seeds had to be started in special beds, protected from late frost, then transplanted to fields at precisely the right moment when soil temperature and moisture content aligned with weather patterns that experienced farmers could read in cloud formations and wind direction. The plants required constant attention throughout their growing season, with workers topping the flowers to force energy into leaf production, removing suckers that sprouted between main stems, and monitoring for hornworms that could devastate entire sections if left unchecked. Grant had been assigned to Field 7, a 12-acre section that produced tobacco of such consistent quality that Ashton Bishop frequently brought potential buyers to observe cultivation techniques that generated premium prices at Richmond auction houses. The assignment was simultaneously an acknowledgement of Grant's expertise and a burden that came with heightened expectations. Any decline in Field 7's productivity would result in punishment that extended beyond the individual worker to include anyone associated with the operation. The overseer system at Blackwood Plantation operated through a hierarchy designed to distance Ashton Bishop from the daily violence required to maintain productivity. Maxwell Hart served as head overseer, a position he'd held for 7 years after proving his willingness to inflict whatever cruelty was necessary to meet harvest quotas. Below him were 3 field overseers who managed specific sections of the plantation, each one responsible for ensuring that their assigned workers met productivity standards through whatever means they deemed appropriate. Brody Nash controlled Fields 5 through 9, making him directly responsible for monitoring Grant's work in Field 7. His approach to management emphasized psychological torture over physical violence, though he was perfectly willing to employ both when he judged it necessary. He had developed techniques for breaking enslaved workers' spirits without damaging their bodies to the point where productivity declined. His methods included separating families as punishment for minor infractions, withholding food rations to create competition among workers, and conducting random nighttime inspections that prevented anyone from experiencing uninterrupted sleep. The summer of 1852 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures exceeding 95 degrees for 30 consecutive days, while humidity levels made physical labor feel like working underwater. The combination of heat and moisture created ideal conditions for tobacco growth, but pushed human endurance beyond sustainable limits. Workers collapsed in the fields with increasing frequency, their bodies simply shutting down when core temperatures exceeded levels compatible with continued consciousness. Ashton Bishop's response to the heat-related casualties had been to increase work hours rather than provide additional water or rest periods. His logic reflected calculations that prioritized short-term profit over long-term sustainability of his labor force. Enslaved workers who died from heat exhaustion could be replaced through purchase or breeding programs that treated human reproduction as livestock management. The immediate concern was maximizing the current season's harvest before market prices shifted in ways that might reduce profit margins. The plantation operated according to schedules that began before sunrise and continued past sunset during peak harvest season. Workers were awakened by bells that rang at 4:30 in the morning, providing 30 minutes to consume whatever breakfast could be prepared from the previous day's rations, before assembling in the fields for work that would continue for 16 hours, with only brief breaks for meals that consisted primarily of cornmeal, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small plots adjacent to the slave quarters. Grant's typical day involved inspecting tobacco plants for signs of disease or pest damage, removing lower leaves that had reached optimal ripeness, and hanging harvested tobacco in curing barns where temperature and humidity had to be carefully controlled to prevent mold while allowing proper fermentation. The work required constant judgment calls about when individual plants were ready for harvest, decisions that could significantly impact the final product's market value. The economic structure supporting Blackwood Plantation depended entirely on the unpaid labor of enslaved workers whose productivity generated wealth that flowed exclusively to Ashton Bishop and his family. The plantation's annual tobacco production averaged 180,000 pounds, selling at prices ranging from 12 to 18 cents per pound, depending on quality grades determined at auction. The gross revenue of nearly $30,000 per year represented extraordinary wealth in 1852 America, placing the Bishop family among Virginia's economic elite. But the human cost of generating this wealth never appeared in accounting ledgers that documented expenses and profits. The shortened lifespans, the chronic injuries, the psychological trauma, the destroyed families, and the stolen potential of hundreds of people existed outside the mathematical frameworks that reduced human beings to assets whose value could be calculated based on their productive capacity and remaining working years. Grant had watched his mother die from lung disease caused by decades of inhaling tobacco dust in poorly ventilated curing barns. He had seen his younger brother sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi after Ashton Bishop decided that keeping families together was less profitable than liquidating excess labor during an economic downturn. He had witnessed countless acts of casual cruelty that served no purpose, beyond reinforcing the power dynamics that allowed one group of humans to claim ownership over another. The first indication that something had shifted in Grant Porter came during the third week of July when Brodie Nash noticed that Field 7's productivity had increased by nearly 15% despite the oppressive heat that was reducing output in other sections of the plantation. The improvement seemed suspicious rather than commendable, suggesting that Grant had discovered efficiencies that other workers had somehow overlooked, despite decades of experience with identical cultivation techniques. Brodie's initial response was to increase Grant's workload, assigning him responsibility for additional rows that would test whether the productivity gains could be sustained under expanded obligations. The logic reflected standard plantation management theory that any worker demonstrating above-average capability should be pushed to their absolute limits until they either broke or revealed the maximum sustainable output that could be expected from properly motivated labor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grant absorbed the additional assignments without protest, his expression revealing nothing beyond the practiced neutrality that enslaved workers developed as protection against overseers, who interpreted any emotional display as evidence of defiance requiring correction. His compliance seemed to confirm Brodie's assessment that the productivity improvements resulted from Grant finally working at his full potential, rather than employing the subtle resistance tactics that enslaved workers used to maintain some control over their circumstances. But careful observers might have noticed subtle changes in Grant's behavior that suggested something more complex than simple compliance with increased demands. He had begun spending his brief rest periods examining the soil composition in different sections of Field 7, collecting samples that he would study with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone who'd been farming tobacco for 3 decades. His hands would move through the red clay with almost reverent attention, his fingers testing texture and moisture content with a precision that went beyond practical agricultural assessment. Julia Patterson had been the first to notice Grant's altered demeanor during evening gatherings in the quarters, when enslaved workers would share what little free time they possessed. Her position as a house servant gave her perspectives on both plantation operations and the psychological states of those trapped within the system. She had observed that Grant's usual exhaustion had been replaced by something that looked almost like focused energy, as though he had discovered purpose that transcended the grinding hopelessness that characterized most enslaved workers' existence. Her attempts to engage Grant in conversation about his apparent transformation had been met with responses that deflected inquiry while maintaining social conventions that prevented her from pushing too aggressively. He would acknowledge her observations with non-committal phrases that neither confirmed nor denied that anything had changed, his verbal evasions as practiced as his physical labor. The skill suggested years of learning how to navigate conversations that might lead to dangerous revelations, if not carefully managed. Cullen Vireth had noticed different patterns during her work in the curing barns where harvested tobacco was processed into marketable product. Grant had begun requesting specific barn assignments that seemed to contradict his usual preferences for workstations that offered the least physical strain. He was actively seeking positions that placed him in closer proximity to storage areas where tools and supplies were kept, his interest in these locations appearing casual but occurring with frequency that suggested deliberate planning rather than random coincidence. The curing barns occupied strategic positions throughout the plantation, their locations determined by factors including airflow patterns, proximity to fields, and accessibility for wagons that would transport finished tobacco to market. The structures were substantial buildings constructed from heavy timber and equipped with ventilation systems that required careful management to maintain optimal curing conditions. They also contained equipment ranging from harvesting tools to rope and canvas that served various agricultural purposes. Grant's increased presence in these storage areas had not yet attracted official attention from overseers, whose focus remained on field productivity rather than the movements of individual workers during processing operations. The oversight represented a vulnerability in plantation security systems that had been designed primarily to prevent escapes and detect organized resistance, rather than monitor the subtle repositioning of tools and materials that might serve purposes beyond their intended agricultural applications. Ashton Bishop's personal interactions with enslaved workers had become increasingly erratic during the summer of 1852, his behavior suggesting that the pressures of maintaining plantation profitability were affecting his judgment in ways that created unpredictable dangers. His inspection tours of the fields occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes arriving during the coolest morning hours, other times appearing during afternoon heat, that made extended outdoor activity dangerous, even for well-hydrated individuals who weren't performing physical labor. During one memorable incident in early August, Ashton had personally whipped an enslaved worker named Cameron Steele for the offense of pausing to drink water without explicit permission from an overseer. The punishment had been excessive, even by the brutal standards that normally governed plantation discipline, with Ashton continuing the whipping long after Cameron had lost consciousness. The incident had been witnessed by dozens of workers who understood that their owner's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where any interaction carried the risk of violence that bore no relationship to the severity of alleged infractions. Grant had observed this particular beating from his position in Field 7, his expression remaining carefully neutral while his hands continued working through tobacco plants with mechanical precision. But witnesses who knew him well enough to read subtle body language reported that his jaw had tightened in ways that suggested he was processing information, rather than simply enduring another example of plantation brutality that had become so routine it barely registered as remarkable. The incident with Cameron Steele had been followed by Ashton's decision to reduce food rations across the plantation by 20%, his justification being that market prices for tobacco had declined slightly, and cost-cutting measures were necessary to maintain profit margins. The economic logic was transparently fraudulent since tobacco prices remained at historically high levels, but enslaved workers had no mechanism for challenging decisions that affected their survival, regardless of whether those decisions reflected actual economic necessity. The transformation in Grant Porter's behavior accelerated during the final week of August, when careful observers noticed that he had begun studying Ashton Bishop's routines with an attention to detail that went far beyond what any enslaved worker would normally risk. His eyes would track the plantation owner's movements across the property, noting the timing of inspection tours, the routes taken through different fields, and the predictable patterns that governed when Ashton would be alone versus accompanied by overseers or family members. His weavers, Faith Gilbert, had been working in the main house for 18 years. Her position as head cook providing access to information about the Bishop family's schedules and habits that remained invisible to field workers. Her observations of Grant during his occasional trips to the kitchen for work-related communications had revealed something that made her deeply uneasy. He was asking questions about Ashton's daily routines that had no connection to agricultural operations. His inquiries disguised as casual conversation but probing for specific details about timing and locations. The questions had seemed innocent enough initially, but their cumulative pattern suggested systematic intelligence gathering rather than idle curiosity. Grant wanted to know when Ashton typically inspected Field 7, whether he followed consistent routes through the tobacco rows, and whether he made these inspections alone or with escort. The level of detail he sought implied planning that extended beyond simply avoiding unwanted attention from the plantation owner. Faith's decision to share her observations with Grant directly, rather than reporting them to overseers, represented a calculated risk that reflected her assessment that whatever he was planning might represent justified response to circumstances that had become intolerable. Her position gave her perspective on how Ashton Bishop treated his family members versus his enslaved workers, the contrast revealing that his capacity for violence was directed exclusively toward those who lacked any legal protection or social status. The conversation between Faith and Grant occurred in the root cellar beneath the main kitchen, a location that provided privacy while offering plausible explanation for their presence if interrupted. Her direct confrontation about his unusual behavior had been met with silence that lasted long enough to make her question whether she had miscalculated the situation. But eventually Grant had spoken words that changed everything about how she understood his recent transformation. "A man can only be treated like an animal for so long before he starts thinking like one," Grant had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And animals don't ask permission before they defend themselves." The statement had been sufficiently vague to maintain deniability, while clearly indicating that Grant had moved beyond passive acceptance of his circumstances into territory where active resistance was being contemplated. Faith's response had been equally careful, acknowledging his words without explicitly endorsing or condemning whatever actions he might be considering. Grant's methodical preparation continued through careful repositioning of tools and materials that could serve multiple purposes depending on how they were employed. A tobacco hoe could harvest plants or dig holes deep enough to bury objects that needed to be hidden from casual inspection. Rope used for hanging tobacco in curing barns could also be used to restrain someone whose movements needed to be controlled. Canvas tarps designed to protect harvested tobacco from rain could conceal things that shouldn't be visible to anyone passing through the fields. The physical layout of Field 7 had been studied with an intensity that went beyond agricultural assessment. Grant had identified locations where the tobacco plants grew tall enough and dense enough to prevent anyone from seeing more than a few feet in any direction. He had noted where the irrigation ditches created natural barriers that would make certain routes more likely than others for someone walking through the field. He had observed how the afternoon sun created shadows that fell in predictable patterns based on the time of day and season of the year. Eli Barrett had worked alongside Grant for 15 years, their shared experiences creating bonds that existed outside the formal social structures governing plantation life. His observations of Grant's recent behavior had prompted questions that were initially deflected, but eventually acknowledged through admissions that revealed the broad outlines of what was being planned without providing details that could be reported if Eli was questioned by overseers. Sometimes a man reaches a point where living isn't the same as surviving, Grant had told Eli during one of their brief conversations. And when you realize you've already lost everything that makes life worth living, you start understanding that you've got nothing left to lose. The philosophical observation had been accompanied by requests that Eli maintain careful observation of Brody Nash's movements during the coming days, particularly noting when the overseer conducted his rounds through Field 7, and whether his timing followed predictable patterns. The intelligence gathering was being distributed across multiple people in ways that prevented any single individual from possessing enough information to fully understand what was being planned. The August humidity transformed Field 7 into a steam bath where visibility shimmered and sound carried in unpredictable ways that made private conversations possible even in an environment designed for constant surveillance. Grant Porter had selected a location deep within the tobacco rows, where the broad leaves created natural walls that blocked sightlines, while the rustle of vegetation masked voices that needed to remain unheard by anyone positioned more than 15 feet away. The packed red clay beneath his feet had been studied with the same attention he once gave to cultivation techniques, his knowledge now focused on depths and soil composition that served purposes having nothing to do with growing crops. Hayden Burke had been summoned to this hidden meeting space, through signals so subtle that anyone observing would have seen only normal field operations. His expertise with carpentry and construction made him valuable for consultations about structural questions that had nothing to do with building projects approved by plantation management. Grant's questions focused on dimensions and load-bearing calculations that seemed academic, until Hayden realized they pertained to creating spaces underground that could contain specific volumes while maintaining structural integrity against collapse. How deep would a man need to dig to create a chamber that wouldn't cave in on itself? Grant had asked, his tone suggesting casual curiosity rather than urgent planning. And what kind of support structure would keep the walls stable if someone was placed inside for an extended period? Hayden's response had been careful, providing technical information without acknowledging the obvious implications of questions about underground chambers sized for human occupancy. His experience with plantation construction projects had taught him that certain knowledge was dangerous to possess explicitly, but valuable when conveyed through discussions that maintained plausible deniability about their actual purpose. He described timber framing techniques used in mine shafts and root cellars, the spacing of support beams required to prevent collapse, and the importance of proper ventilation to prevent suffocation in confined underground spaces. The technical consultation had been followed by Grant's requests for information about tool locations and security measures governing access to equipment that wasn't directly related to agricultural work. Hayden's position maintaining plantation buildings gave him knowledge about where specialized tools were stored and which locations received minimal oversight from personnel whose primary focus remained on preventing theft of valuable property, rather than monitoring repositioning of items that seemed to have little resale value. Parker Grant had been approached separately with questions about the properties of various plant materials found throughout the plantation grounds. His knowledge of herbal remedies and natural medicines made him the informal medical practitioner for enslaved workers who lacked access to professional physicians, except in cases where property value justified the expense of expert treatment. Grant Porter's inquiries focused on substances that could induce unconsciousness without causing immediate death, his interest in dosages and application methods suggesting purposes that extended beyond treating common ailments. Some plants can put a man to sleep so deep he won't wake for hours, Parker had explained during their carefully orchestrated conversation. Jimson weed mixed with certain roots creates effects that look like natural exhaustion, especially if the person's already been working in heat that makes everyone tired. The trick is getting the dose right so they go down slow rather than all at once, makes it look more natural if anyone's watching. The botanical consultation had included discussions about how different substances could be administered through food, drink, or even absorbed through skin contact if concentrations were sufficient and exposure time adequate. Parker's willingness to share this information reflected his understanding that Grant's questions served purposes that aligned with interests extending beyond individual benefit to encompass broader concerns about the sustainability of conditions that had become intolerable for everyone trapped within the plantation system. Ashton Bishop's inspection routines had been documented with the precision of a military intelligence operation, every detail recorded through observations compiled by multiple workers whose positions throughout the plantation provided comprehensive coverage of the owner's movements. The pattern that emerged revealed a man whose habits had calcified into predictable rituals that served psychological needs rather than practical plantation management requirements. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, Ashton would conduct personal inspections of Field 7, walking through the tobacco rows alone, while making observations that he would later share with Brody Nash regarding cultivation techniques and harvest timing. The inspections typically lasted 45 minutes, during which Ashton would move methodically through predetermined routes that had been worn into visible paths by years of repeated traversal. His isolation during these inspections reflected confidence that his authority was so absolute that no enslaved worker would dare challenge him even when he was completely alone and vulnerable. The location where Ashton typically paused for extended examination of plant quality had been identified through careful observations spanning 3 weeks of consecutive inspections. The spot occupied the field's northwestern corner, where a slight depression in the terrain created a natural low point that collected water during heavy rains and produced tobacco plants of exceptional size due to enhanced soil moisture. Ashton would spend 10 to 15 minutes in this location, his attention focused entirely on plant examination, while his back remained turned toward the field's interior, where workers continued their assigned tasks. Grant had begun positioning himself in Field 7 during the hours preceding Ashton's scheduled inspections, his presence explained through work assignments that placed him legitimately in locations that would seem natural rather than suspicious. The careful staging reflected understanding that success depended on creating circumstances that appeared routine until the moment when routine transformed into something that could never be explained away as accident or coincidence. The physical preparation of the burial site had been conducted across multiple days, through incremental excavation that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. The location selected was offset from Ashton's usual inspection route by approximately 30 feet, close enough to be reached quickly but far enough to prevent accidental discovery during normal field operations. The tobacco plants surrounding the site had been cultivated to grow with particular density, their leaves creating natural curtains that would block visibility from any angle except directly overhead. The excavation itself had been accomplished during early morning hours before overseers arrived to monitor field activities, Grant's work disguised as routine soil preparation for planting, despite the season being wrong for such activities. The hole measured 6 feet deep and 4 feet square, its dimensions calculated to contain an adult male with minimal clearance, while maximizing the psychological impact of confinement in a space that would feel simultaneously like a grave and a cage. The timber frame that would support the burial chamber's walls had been constructed from materials salvaged from abandoned outbuildings, the wood aged and weathered in ways that would make it difficult to determine when the lumber had been repurposed for unauthorized projects. Hayden Burke's expertise had been essential for creating a structure that would support the weight of soil and a wooden covering while maintaining an interior chamber that wouldn't collapse and kill its occupant before sufficient time had passed to serve Grant's purposes. The ventilation system represented the most technically sophisticated aspect of the construction, requiring careful calculation to provide enough airflow to prevent suffocation while limiting oxygen supply to the point where consciousness would be maintained but physical strength too depleted to enable escape. The design incorporated principles borrowed from tobacco-curing barns where precise air circulation made the difference between premium product and worthless waste. The knowledge now applied to purposes its original practitioners could never have imagined. Joseph Taylor had been recruited to assist with the final stages of preparation despite his initial resistance to involvement in activities that could result in execution if discovered before completion. His position as a field supervisor among enslaved workers gave him authority to direct others without attracting attention from white overseers who relied on enslaved leadership to manage day-to-day operations. His ultimate agreement to participate reflected the calculation that Grant's plan represented the kind of direct action that might inspire broader resistance if it succeeded, potentially creating momentum toward changes that passive endurance would never achieve. The selection of Friday, August 29th as the date for implementation had been determined through careful analysis of multiple factors, including weather forecasts, harvest schedules, and the timing of overseer rotations that would create optimal conditions for executing the plan with minimal risk of interruption during critical phases. The tobacco harvest was approaching peak intensity, creating circumstances where all available labor was focused on bringing in crops before weather conditions could damage plants that represented the plantation's entire economic foundation for the year. The system that enslaved over 4 million human beings across the American South in 1852 represented the most economically sophisticated form of oppression ever created, its mechanisms refined through generations of legal frameworks, social conventions, and physical violence that worked together to extract maximum labor value while minimizing costs associated with maintaining human property. The institution's defenders presented it as a benevolent arrangement that provided care for people allegedly incapable of self-governance. But the reality revealed a calculated economic structure that generated extraordinary wealth for owners, while inflicting comprehensive destruction on every aspect of enslaved people's existence. Blackwood Plantation's operations reflected the brutal efficiency of a system that had perfected the mathematics of human exploitation through 2 centuries of continuous refinement. Ashton Bishop's ancestors had experimented with different approaches to labor management, eventually developing protocols that maximized productivity while maintaining just enough physical health among enslaved workers to preserve their capacity for continued labor without incurring replacement costs that would impact profit margins. The economic calculations underlying plantation operations treated enslaved workers as capital assets whose value could be assessed through actuarial tables that predicted remaining working years based on age, health status, and skill levels. A prime field hand in his 20s represented an investment worth $1,200 to $1,500, an amount that could be recovered through 10 to 15 years of labor that generated annual value far exceeding the costs of basic subsistence required to maintain productive capacity. But the financial accounting that documented plantation profitability never captured the full scope of what was extracted from enslaved workers. The stolen labor represented only the most visible component of a system that also confiscated family relationships, cultural heritage, educational opportunities, personal autonomy, and the fundamental human right to control one's own body and determine one's own future. The total theft encompassed everything that made human existence meaningful, reducing people to instruments that served exclusively to generate wealth for others. The legal frameworks supporting enslavement had been constructed through legislative and judicial decisions that defined enslaved people as property rather than persons, stripping them of any rights that could be enforced against owners who possessed absolute authority over every aspect of their existence. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 had established principles that remained largely unchanged in 1852, creating legal categories that placed enslaved people outside protections extended to recognized humans, while simultaneously holding them criminally responsible for actions that threatened property interests or social order. The ideology justifying this legal structure drew from religious doctrines that presented enslavement as divinely ordained, scientific theories that claimed biological inferiority of African peoples, and economic arguments that characterized the system as essential for Southern prosperity and national economic growth. The intellectual frameworks were transparently self-serving, but they provided psychological cover for people who needed to believe they were engaged in legitimate enterprise, rather than systematic human rights violations that would eventually be recognized as among history's greatest crimes. Ashton Bishop's personal participation in this system reflected the psychological adaptations required to reconcile Christian religious beliefs with practices that violated every principle of human dignity and moral reciprocity that Christianity supposedly endorsed. His ability to attend church services on Sunday while ordering brutal punishments on Monday demonstrated the cognitive compartmentalization that allowed otherwise reasonable people to engage in monstrous behavior without experiencing debilitating psychological conflict. The violence required to maintain the enslavement system operated through carefully calibrated applications of force that balanced deterrence against the practical concern that excessive brutality could damage or destroy valuable property. The threat of physical punishment served to enforce compliance with work requirements and behavioral expectations, but actual implementation of violence was theoretically limited by economic considerations that should have discouraged actions that would reduce enslaved workers' productivity or market value. In practice, these theoretical limitations provided minimal protection because they depended entirely on owners' self-restraint and recognition that their long-term economic interests required preserving the health and working capacity of their human property. When owners' psychological needs for dominance and control conflicted with economic rationality, the violence often escalated beyond levels that could be justified through any coherent cost-benefit analysis. The summer of 1852 had witnessed Ashton Bishop's descent into forms of cruelty that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his absolute power over people who could not defend themselves or seek protection from authorities who viewed enslaved workers' suffering as irrelevant unless it affected property values. The arbitrary nature of his violence had created an environment where no one could predict what might trigger punishment, transforming the entire plantation into a space where terror was the constant emotional backdrop for every interaction. Grant Porter's evolution from compliance to resistance reflected a psychological transformation that occurred when accumulated trauma reached critical mass that made continued endurance impossible without complete destruction of personality and identity. The specific catalyst had been Ashton's decision to sell Grant's wife Piper Stone to a plantation in South Carolina, separating the couple permanently after 18 years of marriage that had survived, despite constant threats of forced separation that hung over every enslaved family relationship. The sale had been motivated by Ashton's conclusion that Piper's presence was making Grant less willing to accept additional work assignments without subtle resistance that manifested as reduced productivity and minor acts of defiance that individually seemed insignificant but collectively suggested the beginning of psychological withdrawal from complete submission. The economic logic was that separating the couple would eliminate Grant's emotional anchor and force him into complete dependence on the plantation system for any form of human connection. The calculation had backfired catastrophically by removing the primary reason Grant had maintained his commitment to survival within the existing system. With Piper sold and no prospect of ever seeing her again, Grant's motivation shifted from preserving what remained of family life to pursuing justice through the only mechanism available to someone with no legal standing and no access to institutional channels for addressing grievances. The transformation had occurred during the 3 days immediately following Piper's departure, when Grant had experienced psychological crisis that pushed him beyond conventional frameworks for understanding his circumstances. The anger, grief, and despair had eventually crystallized into cold determination to exact revenge through methods that would make Ashton Bishop experience powerlessness and terror equivalent to what he had inflicted on others throughout his life as plantation owner. The plan that emerged from Grant's psychological crucible represented a complete inversion of the power dynamics that defined plantation relationships. Instead of enslaved workers submitting to owner's authority, the owner would be forced into absolute dependence on enslaved workers' mercy. Instead of owner determining enslaved workers' fate through unilateral decisions, enslaved worker would control every aspect of owner's remaining existence. The symmetry was deliberate and essential to Grant's conception of justice, that required Ashton to experience the same helplessness he had imposed on others. The decision to bury Ashton alive rather than kill him quickly reflected Grant's understanding that death would be insufficient punishment for someone who had treated human beings as disposable property. The burial would force Ashton to confront his own mortality while experiencing the terror of slow suffocation in darkness and confinement that mimicked the psychological experience of enslavement. The hours Ashton would spend underground would provide time to contemplate the consequences of having built his entire life on the foundation of other people's suffering. The tobacco field location for the burial carried symbolic significance that was central to Grant's conception of appropriate punishment. The soil that had generated Ashton's wealth through enslaved labor would become his grave, the crops that represented his prosperity transformed into the landscape of his destruction. The irony was deliberate and essential, turning the instrument of oppression into the mechanism of retribution in ways that would make the punishment inseparable from the crime it addressed. Grant's planning had included consideration of what would happen after Ashton's death was discovered, and investigators began searching for explanations. The burial location would eventually be found, but the circumstances would make it difficult to determine exactly what had occurred. The physical evidence would show that Ashton had been placed underground while still alive, but establishing who had done it and how they had accomplished it would require investigative capabilities that local authorities had never needed to develop, because crimes committed by enslaved people against white owners were typically resolved through immediate execution of suspects rather than careful analysis of evidence. The psychological preparation for executing the plan had required Grant to overcome a lifetime of conditioning that had taught him to view white authority as absolute and resistance as futile. The mental transformation involved recognizing that Ashton's power existed only because enslaved workers collectively accepted it, and that individual defiance could shatter the illusion of invincibility that made the entire system function. The realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, opening possibilities that had previously seemed unthinkable, while exposing Grant to consequences that would certainly include his own death if the plan failed or was discovered before completion. The final element of Grant's planning involved creating conditions that would allow other enslaved workers to maintain plausible deniability about any knowledge of what had occurred. The success of the plan depended on Grant acting alone during the critical phases, preventing anyone else from being implicated in ways that could result in collective punishment. The isolation was necessary both practically and morally, ensuring that whatever consequences followed would fall exclusively on the person who had made the decision to transform anger into action that could never be undone. The final week of August transformed Field 7 into a carefully orchestrated theater where every movement served dual purposes visible only to those who understood what Grant Porter was preparing to execute. The tobacco plants had reached their peak height, the broad leaves creating corridors that wound through the field like a maze designed by someone who understood that the best hiding places existed in plain sight, where their obviousness made them invisible to observers expecting concealment to look like secrecy rather than routine agricultural landscape. Grant's daily routine had been adjusted through imperceptible modifications that repositioned him closer to the burial site during the hours when Ashton Bishop typically conducted his inspections. The changes were subtle enough to avoid attracting attention from Brody Nash, whose oversight of Field 7 had become increasingly perfunctory as harvest pressures diverted his focus towards sections where productivity was declining rather than areas where operations appeared to be functioning according to expectations. The lack of scrutiny created opportunities that Grant exploited through careful positioning that placed him exactly where he needed to be without creating patterns that would register as suspicious to anyone reviewing field assignments. The tools required for the plan's execution had been relocated through a process so gradual that no single repositioning would have seemed significant to anyone not tracking the cumulative effect of dozens of minor adjustments. A tobacco hoe that had been stored in the eastern equipment shed now rested against a fence post adjacent to Field 7's northwestern corner. Coils of rope that had occupied space in the main barn were now hanging from hooks in a smaller storage structure that sat within 50 yards of the burial site. A canvas tarp that had covered harvested tobacco in the curing barn had been relocated to a position where it could be accessed within seconds of when it would be needed. Each item served legitimate agricultural purposes that would explain its presence if questioned, but their collective positioning created a resource network that would enable rapid execution of actions, requiring equipment that needed to be immediately available rather than retrieved from distant storage locations. The strategic placement reflected military-style logistics planning applied to circumstances where success depended on eliminating any delays that could create opportunities for intervention or discovery before critical actions were completed. Hayden Burke had completed the final structural modifications to the burial chamber during the pre-dawn hours of August 28, his work conducted in darkness that required him to operate primarily by touch rather than vision. The timber supports had been positioned to create maximum stability while maintaining an interior space that would feel simultaneously like a coffin and a cell. The dimensions had been calculated to prevent Ashton from standing upright or lying fully extended, forcing him into positions that would become increasingly uncomfortable as hours passed, and muscles cramped from being held in configurations that human bodies were not designed to maintain for extended periods. The ventilation system incorporated hollow reeds that extended from the chamber to the surface, their openings concealed among tobacco plant stems in ways that would make them nearly impossible to locate, even for someone who knew they existed somewhere in the immediate vicinity. The airflow they provided had been calibrated through testing with burning candles that measured oxygen consumption rates, the calculations determining that the system would support consciousness for approximately 18 to 24 hours before carbon dioxide accumulation reached levels that would induce unconsciousness followed by death through gradual asphyxiation. The timing was essential to Grant's conception of appropriate punishment. Ashton needed sufficient time to fully comprehend his situation and experience the psychological progression from confusion through fear to terror and ultimately to despair as he realized that no rescue was coming, and that his remaining life could be measured in hours rather than years or decades. The slow death would force contemplation that quick execution would never provide, creating space for Ashton to understand that he was experiencing consequences directly connected to choices he had made throughout his life as plantation owner. Parker Grant had prepared the sedative mixture during the evening of August 27th, combining Jimson weed extract with crushed roots from plants whose properties induced drowsiness without causing the immediate unconsciousness that would make Ashton's transfer to the burial chamber logistically complicated. The dosage had been calculated based on Ashton's estimated body weight and the amount of time Grant needed to complete the burial before the sedative's effects began wearing off, and Ashton regained sufficient consciousness to potentially attract attention through sounds that could be heard by anyone working in adjacent fields. The delivery mechanism for the sedative had been designed to exploit Ashton's habit of drinking from the water barrel that was maintained at Field 7's northern edge for use by workers who needed hydration during the hottest parts of the day. Grant had observed that Ashton would typically drink from this barrel during his inspection tours, the act representing a casual assertion of authority through consuming resources designated for enslaved workers without asking permission, or acknowledging that his actions reduced the water available to people who needed it more desperately than he did. The sedative had been added to the water barrel during the early morning hours of August 29th, the timing calculated to ensure that Ashton would consume it during his scheduled afternoon inspection before the mixture's potency degraded through exposure to heat and sunlight. The amount added represented a careful balance between ensuring sufficient dosage to achieve desired effects, while avoiding concentrations that would make the water's taste so altered that Ashton might become suspicious and refuse to drink. Eli Barrett had been positioned to serve as lookout during the critical period when Grant would be transferring Ashton from the point where the sedative took effect to the burial site where the final phase would be executed. His role required maintaining visual contact with the field's approaches while appearing to conduct normal agricultural work that would explain his presence if questioned by overseers or other workers. The position selected offered clear sightlines toward the main house and the paths that Brody Nash typically used when conducting his rounds, providing sufficient warning time if intervention threatened before Grant could complete the burial. The communication system that would alert Grant to potential problems consisted of bird calls that were common enough in the Virginia countryside to avoid attracting attention but distinct enough to convey specific meanings to listeners who understood the code. A mockingbird's song would indicate that approaches were clear and operations could proceed. A crow's call would signal that overseers were moving toward Field 7, and immediate cessation of suspicious activities was required. A hawk's cry would mean that Ashton's absence had been noticed and search parties were being organized to locate him. Joseph Taylor had agreed to manage the misdirection campaign that would delay discovery of Ashton's disappearance by creating plausible explanations for his absence from expected locations. His plan involved reporting to Brody Nash that he had seen Ashton walking toward the eastern property boundary, where a dispute with a neighboring landowner had been creating tensions that occasionally required personal intervention. The false report would direct initial search efforts away from Field 7, buying Grant the time needed to complete the burial and restore the field's surface appearance to conditions that would make the burial site nearly impossible to detect without knowing exactly where to look. The psychological preparation for executing the plan had consumed Grant's thoughts during the nights leading up to August 29th, his mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from perfect execution to catastrophic failure with every possible variation in between. The uncertainty was manageable because he had moved beyond concern for his own survival into territory where the plan's success mattered more than whether he lived or died in its aftermath. The acceptance of his own likely death had been liberating rather than terrifying, removing the fear that might otherwise have prevented him from taking actions that represented complete commitment to consequences he could not control. The moral dimensions of what he was preparing to do had been examined from every angle his conscience could construct. The internal debate ultimately resolved through recognition that Ashton's treatment of enslaved workers represented ongoing crimes that would continue indefinitely unless someone acted to stop them. The burial would not liberate the other workers or dismantle the enslavement system, but it would remove one perpetrator and demonstrate that the apparent invincibility of plantation owners was an illusion that could be shattered through individual action that rejected the premise that enslaved people were required to accept their oppression without response. Grant understood that his actions would likely trigger brutal retaliation against the entire enslaved population at Blackwood Plantation, the collective punishment representing white authorities' predictable response to any act of resistance that challenged the fundamental power dynamic supporting the enslavement system. The knowledge that others would suffer for his choices created moral anguish that he could only resolve through the belief that continuing to accept intolerable conditions was itself a form of violence against everyone who would be born into enslavement if the system remained unchallenged by those who had the most intimate understanding of its horrors. The hours preceding Ashton's scheduled inspection on August 29 passed with excruciating slowness, each minute feeling like an hour as Grant maintained his assigned work routine while tracking the sun's progress across the sky. The other workers who understood that something was approaching had been instructed to conduct themselves with perfect normalcy, their behavior patterns unchanged from any other day, despite the tension that made every casual interaction feel like performance art, where the slightest misstep could expose preparations that represented months of planning. So, Faith Gilbert had prepared the midday meal with her usual attention to quality, her work in the kitchen proceeding according to routines that had been established through years of service. Her composure was remarkable given her knowledge that the man she had served breakfast to that morning would be underground in a makeshift grave before sunset, his death occurring through actions she had enabled by sharing information about his habits and vulnerabilities. The moral complexity of her position was something she would spend the rest of her life processing, the recognition that she was both witness and participant in events that would define her understanding of justice and complicity. The positioning of witnesses had been coordinated to ensure that Grant's actions during the critical moments would be observed by enough people to prevent complete denial, but not so many that individual testimonies could be compiled into a comprehensive narrative that would make prosecution straightforward. The strategic ambiguity was designed to protect Grant through creating reasonable doubt about exactly what had occurred and who had been involved, though everyone understood that legal protections meant nothing when accused parties were enslaved people and victims were white property owners. The August sun reached its apex at precisely 1:45 in the afternoon on August 29, 1852, casting shadows that fell at angles Grant Porter had studied for weeks in preparation for the moment when theory would transform into action that could never be undone. The temperature had climbed to 97 degrees, the humidity making the air feel like liquid that required effort to breathe while sweat poured from every pore in ways that made physical exertion feel like working underwater. The conditions were perfect for what Grant needed to accomplish, because the heat provided ready explanation for anyone who might collapse from what would appear to be exhaustion rather than chemically induced sedation. Ashton Bishop emerged from the main house at precisely 2 o'clock, his punctuality reflecting the rigid adherence to schedule that governed his entire existence. His clothing marked his status through fabric quality and tailoring that announced wealth and authority to anyone who might have doubted his position at the top of Blackwood Plantation's social hierarchy. The wide-brimmed hat that protected his face from direct sunlight represented a luxury that enslaved workers laboring in the same fields would never be permitted, the differential treatment serving as constant visual reminder of the vast distance between owner and owned. His walk toward Field 7 followed the path he had traced hundreds of times before, his confidence in the routine's safety reflecting decades of unchallenged authority that had never provided reason to consider vulnerability or danger. The other enslaved workers he passed lowered their eyes in the submissive gestures that plantation protocol required, their deference so practiced that it appeared natural rather than performed compliance with social conventions enforced through violence. Grant maintained his position at the field's northwestern corner, his hands moving through tobacco plants with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed identical motions tens of thousands of times. His breathing remained steady despite the adrenaline that was flooding his system and making his heart race at rates that threatened to compromise the appearance of normalcy he needed to project. The years of practicing emotional control under conditions of extreme stress had prepared him for this moment when any visible tension could alert Ashton that something was different about today's inspection. The Mockingbird's call from Eli Barrett's position signaled that approaches remained clear and no overseers were moving toward Field 7. The communication provided final confirmation that circumstances were optimal for proceeding with actions that would transform the afternoon from routine agricultural inspection into something that would alter the trajectories of everyone connected to Blackwood Plantation. Ashton entered Field 7 at 2:07, his arrival slightly delayed by a conversation with Maxwell Hart about harvest schedules and market timing. His mood appeared neutral rather than particularly positive or negative, his emotional state reflecting the baseline satisfaction of someone whose life had proceeded according to expectations with minimal disruption or disappointment. The complacency was about to be shattered in ways that would compress a lifetime of accumulated terror into the final hours of existence that could be measured in increments too brief to accommodate the full scope of realization about what his choices had created. Huntuntiku. The walk through the tobacco rows proceeded according to Ashton's usual pattern, his observations focusing on plant health and harvest readiness, with the practiced eye of someone who could assess crop quality through visual inspection that required no laboratory analysis or expert consultation. His movements were unhurried, his attention absorbed by agricultural assessment that prevented him from noticing the subtle repositioning of tools and materials that surrounded him like pieces on a chessboard, where all the significant moves had already been made before the game appeared to begin. The water barrel at the field's northern edge sat where it had been positioned every day throughout the growing season, its presence so routine that Ashton would have noticed only if it had been absent rather than present. The barrel's exterior showed no indication that its contents had been altered from pure water to mixture, containing compounds that would shortly begin affecting his neurological and cardiovascular systems in ways that would become progressively more difficult to resist as minutes passed and concentrations built within his bloodstream. Ashton lifted the dipper at 2:23, raising it to his lips in a gesture so casual that it held no significance to anyone who might have been watching. The water tasted slightly bitter but not so altered that he hesitated before consuming the full dipper, and that a second one, because the heat made hydration feel necessary, despite his usual reluctance to drink from sources shared with enslaved workers. The psychological barrier that normally prevented such sharing had been overcome by physical need that temporarily superseded social conditioning about maintaining separation between owner and owned. Grant had been counting seconds since observing Ashton drink from the barrel, his internal clock tracking the estimated time required for the sedative to begin taking effect based on Parker Grant's calculations about absorption rates and dosage potency. The mixture had been formulated to produce gradual onset rather than sudden collapse, the progression designed to mimic heat exhaustion that would explain why Ashton might stumble or appear disoriented without immediately suggesting chemical causes that would prompt investigation. The first visible signs appeared at 2:29 when Ashton paused mid-stride and raised his hand to his forehead in a gesture suggesting dizziness or sudden discomfort. His expression shifted from confident assessment to confusion, as he tried to process sensations that didn't match his expectations about how his body should be responding to familiar environmental conditions. The confusion would progress through several stages before reaching the point where cognitive function deteriorated enough to prevent effective resistance to whatever came next. Grant moved toward Ashton with the deferential posture expected from enslaved workers approaching their owners, his body language communicating concern rather than threat, in ways that would prevent Ashton from recognizing danger until circumstances had progressed beyond the point where recognition would matter. His voice carried appropriate worry when he spoke words that were simultaneously genuine offer of assistance and calculated deception about his actual intentions. "Master Bishop, you're looking poorly from this heat. Perhaps you should sit down before you fall down." Ashton's response was slurred speech that confirmed the sedative was working faster than the conservative estimates Parker had provided, the accelerated timeline creating pressure to move quickly through remaining phases before the effects became so pronounced that Ashton's obvious incapacitation would attract attention from anyone positioned to observe Field 7's interior. Grant's hand supported Ashton's elbow in a grip that appeared helpful but was actually guiding him toward the location where the tobacco plants grew most densely, and the burial site waited beneath a thin layer of soil that concealed the chamber that had been prepared for occupancy. The progression from confused standing to seated collapse occurred over approximately 90 seconds, Ashton's body responding to chemical influences that were overwhelming his nervous system's ability to maintain consciousness and muscle coordination. His eyes showed awareness that something was terribly wrong, but his capacity to articulate concerns or call for help had been compromised by sedative effects that were suppressing cognitive functions faster than his remaining awareness could process the implications. Grant lowered Ashton into the sitting position at 2:31, the placement calculated to position him directly adjacent to the burial site, whose covering had been designed for rapid removal when the moment arrived. The tobacco plants surrounding them created visual barriers that would make intervention unlikely, even if someone entered Field 7 during the next critical minutes, when Grant would be most vulnerable to discovery. The words Grant spoke next had been rehearsed mentally hundreds of times, but actually saying them to the man who had controlled every aspect of his existence for 31 years created emotional resonance that exceeded anything his preparation had anticipated. His voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what he was announcing to someone whose consciousness was fading but who remained aware enough to understand that his life was ending and why. "You sold my wife because you could, you beat us because you could, you worked us until we dropped because you could. Now I'm putting you in the ground because I can, and you're going to have time to think about how it feels to be powerless, while someone else decides whether you live or die." Ashton's attempt to respond produced only incoherent sounds, his mouth forming words that his voice could no longer articulate with sufficient clarity to be understood. The frustration visible in his eyes confirmed that he comprehended what was happening, even as his ability to resist or call for help disappeared beneath chemical effects that had progressed to the point where physical intervention was impossible. The transfer of Ashton's body into the burial chamber required strength Grant had been conserving throughout the day specifically for this moment, when he needed to move deadweight that represented nearly 200 pounds of mass that couldn't assist with its own positioning. The chamber's opening yawned like a mouth waiting to consume something that would never be returned to the surface world, where sunlight and air represented conditions that Ashton had taken for granted throughout his 43 years of existence. The descent into darkness occurred at 2:34. Ashton's body lowered through the opening with care that prevented injury, not out of compassion but from practical recognition that the punishment required him to remain conscious and aware for as long as the ventilation system could support life. The thud of his body settling against the chamber floor marked the transition from preparation to execution, the point where theory became reality that would proceed according to physical laws that would not be influenced by regret or second thoughts. Grant's positioning of Ashton within the chamber ensured that he would regain consciousness in a position that maximized discomfort while preventing the kind of movement that might allow him to discover the ventilation reeds or develop enough leverage to attempt breaking through the timber supports. The arrangement was methodical rather than cruel for cruelty's sake, each constraint serving purposes connected to ensuring that the punishment achieved its intended effects. The wooden covering that sealed the chamber's opening had been constructed to fit precisely within the dimensions of the hole, its weight sufficient to prevent lifting from below even if Ashton regained enough strength to attempt escape. The positioning took less than 30 seconds, the practiced movements reflecting Grant's preparation and determination to complete the task before circumstances could prevent final implementation. The soil that covered the wooden lid fell in carefully measured amounts, each shovelful distributed to create the appearance of normal ground surface that would make the burial site nearly invisible to anyone not knowing exactly where to look. The tobacco plants that had been temporarily relocated were returned to positions that concealed any remaining evidence of excavation, their leaves creating natural camouflage that would make discovery unlikely, even during careful inspection. Grant completed the surface restoration at 2:41. The entire sequence from Ashton's collapse to sealed burial consuming exactly 10 minutes that had transformed the power dynamics defining their relationship for Grant's entire life. The shovel was returned to its storage position, the excess soil scattered across the field in patterns that would be indistinguishable from normal agricultural activity, and the evidence that anything unusual had occurred was reduced to levels that would require forensic examination to detect. Yaglakt was ours. The psychological transition from planning to completion created emotional responses Grant had not fully anticipated despite his extensive mental preparation. The absence of triumph or satisfaction surprised him because he had assumed that successful execution would generate feelings of vindication or justice served. Instead, he experienced only exhaustion and the recognition that Ashton's death would not resurrect Piper or undo any of the trauma that had accumulated over 31 years of enslavement. The realization that revenge provided no healing even when perfectly executed represented a lesson Grant would have preferred to learn through less permanent means. But the knowledge came too late to matter because the actions could not be reversed, and consequences would unfold regardless of whether he had achieved the psychological closure he had been seeking. The emptiness was almost worse than the anger it replaced, leaving him with nothing except the certainty that he had killed a man who deserved to die, but whose death changed nothing about the fundamental conditions that had made the murder seem necessary. Eli Barrett's signal indicated that Brody Nash was approaching Field 7, the timing creating immediate pressure to establish presence in locations that would explain Grant's activities and provide alibis that might withstand initial questioning. The transition from burial site to normal work position required suppressing any behavioral indicators that might suggest recent exertion beyond what agricultural labor would produce. The performance demanding absolute control over physical responses that wanted to manifest stress through trembling or accelerated breathing. The confrontation with Brody occurred at 2:47 when the overseer entered Field 7 looking for Ashton Bishop, whose absence from expected locations had been noted by Maxwell Hart and was generating concern that would shortly escalate into organized search efforts. Grant's response to questions about whether he had seen the plantation owner was delivered with precisely calibrated deference and apparent confusion that suggested genuine ignorance rather than calculated deception. Saw him walking through about 20 minutes past, but he headed toward the eastern side and I've been working this section since then. You want me to help look for him? The offer to assist with the search represented psychological misdirection that positioned Grant as concerned worker rather than potential suspect, the performance so convincing that Brody dismissed him as irrelevant to whatever had caused Ashton's disappearance. The overseer's departure to organize systematic search of the plantation's eastern boundary provided exactly the misdirection Joseph Taylor's false report had been designed to create, buying time that would not prevent ultimate discovery, but would delay it long enough for Ashton to experience the full psychological impact of his situation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.